bonus episode. I recently had the pleasure to sit down with actor extraordinaire Rib Hillis, who will be starring as the great Jim Bridger in The Tall Tales of Jim Bridger, airing January 11th on INSP. Joining Rib is writer, producer, and Emmy-nominated director Paul Epstein. You may have seen Paul's work on Into the Wild Frontier, as well as a variety of other shows on both Discovery and Nat Geo. Now, I normally don't do interviews, reason being I'm not very good at it, but thankfully Rib and Paul did most of the heavy lifting. I was able to just sit back and enjoy the show. In addition to hearing all about the upcoming Tall Tales of Jim Bridger, you'll also hear what it was like for Rib to immerse himself in the role, along with some pretty cool behind-the-scenes stories. And we do talk quite a bit about history, so even if you don't even own a TV, I think you'll enjoy this. Both of these guys know their history, they know Jim Bridger, and you can tell they're definitely as passionate about the topic as we are. So without further ado, it is my great pleasure to present to you Rib Hillis and Paul Epstein. Thank you, gentlemen, for joining me. Rib, I know we were just talking. You wanted to interview me.
Well, yeah.
Before you get started with that, let's talk about the Tall Tales of Jim Bridger just real quick. Tall Tales of Jim Bridger is not a documentary, though. Can y'all give the listeners like a good idea what the show's about?
Yeah, let me take this one, Rib, real quick. I have a little easy way to explain it. So, the show Into the Wild Frontier, Josh, that you've seen is what is usually called a docudrama series, or sometimes called a specialist factual series. But it is a dramatization of real stories, and it combines documentary components like expert interviews and archival material with dramatizations of the events that look and sound like, regular TV or movies. And so Into the Wild Frontier is a docudrama, so you will see the occasional expert will get on camera and get on screen to put something in context or to explain a interesting concept that's being covered in the show. The Tall Tales of Jim Bridger is a straight-up TV drama. It's a narrative drama that you would see on any other network. It's got a awesome main character, Jim Bridger. It's got an awesome main character, Jim Bridger, played by the awesome Rib Hillis, and a few other recurring characters. And it also has special guest characters that appear just for one episode. And the last thing to say about Tall Tales of Jim Bridger is it's a close-ended show. Every episode is what we call a case of the week. And it starts off with Jim Bridger finding himself in a situation, and he has the perfect tall tale to address the situation, which could be a conflict, it could be a dramatic situation that he's in. And the show goes into an extended flashback as he tells the story, and we see a younger version of Jim Bridger having this adventure, and then we cut back to the present day of Jim Bridger, which is 1868, and he finishes the tale, and usually there's a moral or a lesson or a resolution of some sort that ends the show.
I actually still use some of the Bridgerisms, like it's all nothing but fool's gold, which, Josh, you'll have to see all the episodes to get. But yeah, it is. I keep thinking about, I was a kid growing up watching Magnum P.I. And I don't know, after I've watched all the episodes of Jim Bridger, and it's got that sort of vibe of like a TV show like that I grew up with, that we do a lot of voiceover, so I have actually sat. That's why I have this wonderful mic. We do voiceover where, as you're watching the show, I, as Jim Bridger, would say, "Well, the year was 1848, and me and Zeb Morton were, trapping up in Ute country." And so there's all this great sort of voiceover to lend, some narrative to it. And then, as Paul was saying, the acting is insane. Like they cast so many incredible actors that would come in and show up every day and work for us that I literally felt like I was just living inside of a play, like the best performance of a play that I was actually in while it was happening right there in front of me. And I'm like, oh yeah, I got it. I better respond. I can't just watch, I have to participate. But yeah, it was quite a joy.
Well, are you guys familiar with Colonel Dale Dye?
Yeah, I think he's a World War II veteran, or I'm not sure he's a veteran or not. But
Vietnam veteran.
Vietnam veteran who consults for. He's a military technical advisor for TV and film. Is that right?
Right. He's acted in a few movies. I think he was in Band of Brothers and Platoon, little bit roles. But from what I understand, he kind of invented the concept of actor boot camps. Like he'll take the actors for an upcoming war movie. He'll run them through like a mini military basic training. Rumor has it, I don't know if this is true, he reduced some actors to tears on the set of Saving Private Ryan. It was pretty hard training.
Well, it's not that hard to reduce actors to tears. Actors are trained to. The actors are basically trained to come to tears.
Oh man, you got a great point there. Well, are y'all doing anything similar in Montana? Are y'all having these guys wade in frozen creeks, or maybe locking them in a cage with grizzly bears, something like that, to see what they're made of?
Oh, I don't know, Paul, if there was anything. Yeah, I don't know if Paul did anything intentional that they set up like that, but certainly we would show up on this location outside of Missoula, and I don't know if Jim Bridger was actually ever there, but certainly it's probable. Certainly there were mountain men and natives in that area, and once we leave sort of our base camp, we're out on location, and there's nothing. There's no amenities. I mean, honestly, there were some times that we didn't even have a porta potty on like the location we were at. Nobody's, there's no sort of boot camp where we're going to make you suffer a little bit in order to get into character. But just standing there, and I don't know, Josh, if you have been in Montana, but it is literally
Not yet.
It is a leading character in any movie or TV show. It is so epically gorgeous that you can't help but feel, oh my God, this must have been what it was like. We were up there in the summer times. I've spent quite a bit of time in Montana over the last 10 years, and I've been there quite a bit in the winter. I've gotten into ice climbing, and I think about these guys, and whatever, and the women that might have been out there, but these mountain men and the natives, and they were living without synthetic clothes. They didn't have a big lighter in the middle of winter. Like I keep telling Paul we should try to shoot some stuff in the winter, and obviously I've shot in the winter in Montana. It's hard, but we don't have whoever this colonel guy is putting us through boot camp. The state of Montana just puts us through boot camp. Oh, and the mosquitoes. Whoa, don't even get me started about the mosquitoes.
Pretty bad.
Yeah, there's like a short.
Well, there's a lot of them. There's a short period. There's a mosquito period of time. It's like kind of like the end of May, beginning of June, where for about maybe a week or 2 weeks, it's just mosquito time. And, we're shooting next to rivers frequently because a lot of the stories take place in rivers, and rivers have, they're photogenic, they have production value. And so, there's a period where everybody would just be losing their minds with mosquitoes. And luckily it doesn't last that long, but during that time, everybody's hosing themselves down with bug spray. And I get mosquito netting, I wrap it around my hat and stuff, and you just got to power through it. And to Rib's point, the mountain men and the real or fictional characters that we portray in the show would always endure that, but without any relief of any kind. They simply would have to get bitten and deal with it because they had nothing like a bug repellent, nothing that would suitable to be a covering or like a mosquito netting or anything like that, and no place to go either. At least at the end of the day, we go back to our hotel. There's no mosquitoes. For the mountain men of this period, you're just enduring it, and you're dealing with it, and it's just a fact of the experience. And lots of the chroniclers, lots of people who wrote home or wrote memoirs or wrote of their experiences would comment on this and how dreadful it was, and how in some cases literally drive, trappers or settlers or immigrants to go temporarily insane from the mosquitoes. In terms of a boot camp, we don't really have the time or the budget to do it as much as I would like. So when every actor arrives on set, there's one main thing that we have to make sure they get right from the outset, just for our own sense of creative integrity, and also because it's something that will look bad on camera right off the bat. And that is how to hold and handle and carry and fire a muzzle-loading rifle. And so we have a armorer on set who's he's a mountain man reenactor. He's in a lot of different reenactment groups. He's a professional film and TV armorer. He's a living expert in firearms of this period and many periods. And so every time a new actor would arrive for their first day of shooting, the first thing I would say is right after so-and-so is out of makeup and costume, get him into gun club. We called it gun club. And we would let Mark, our armorer, spend as much time as he could just showing him there is a right way and a wrong way to hold a flintlock long barrel rifle. And there's a right way and a wrong way to rest it when you're talking to somebody. And there's a right way and wrong way to aim it. And so Rib mastered that quite quickly. And Rib will tell you he never put his rifle down for a minute from start to finish for the entire production. Even if in the scene, I'm like, maybe Bridger would put his rifle down, and Rib would be like, well, maybe, but he might not. And I would usually defer. But that's one example of a very mini boot camp that we would do, which is making sure that an actor who, in many cases, had never touched any firearm before, but certainly not this kind of these unique and specialty firearms of the period that had to be handled a certain way. You just need to look like it's an attachment of your arm. You need to look like you always have it on you. And so we try to get the actors in the habit of carrying it correctly. And that goes from walking with it to resting it on your boot if you're speaking to somebody, or how you would cradle it in certain ways. And particularly, of course, when you're firing it, if they're in the scenes that we're doing, if they're hunting, or if they're fighting, the way to load and fire one of these flintlock muskets is a very specific skill set, and has a lot of steps. And it's something that takes a little bit of time to master. But that's something we would invest time and effort in to make sure that the actors would get it right.
Well, from what I've seen, y'all did a really good job. Rib, I'll be honest, when you first reached out, I looked at your IMDb page, and my initial reaction was, this dude's too pretty to play Jim Bridger. No homo. But I was just like, Jim Bridger, he's this rugged, just real rough around the edges guy. And then you got this actor guy here. He's too handsome, man. He's just too handsome to be Jim Bridger. But you pulled it off. I watched 2 episodes so far, and as far as I'm concerned, you pulled it off. You do seem, you were very comfortable with that rifle. You look like, you'd been eating antelope jerky for a while, living out in the mountains. So I think y'all did a very good job.
Well, thank you. Yeah,
I'm not coming on to you, bro. I'm just saying.
It's I've been called more, but no, I agree with you. When we think of mountain men, they're these just like iconic, sort of rugged, and it's not their their aesthetics. It's just they're so they can handle anything, but they do a great job. Certainly, getting in the wardrobe goes a long way. And then I grow my beard out more than it is now. And then obviously you watch the episodes when they aged Jim up to, I guess he's supposed to be in his 60s. And then I go down into my 40s. They put this big beard on me that I remember the first time we did it in the pilot episode, and it felt really weird to have this huge, bushy beard hanging down. But something, and Paul and I we were talking about it, before we started taping, that after 10 episodes, there's something about wearing that beard. And I grew up in Boston. I can start dropping my eyes and talk like I'm a Boston accent, and if I can go have a beer down in Fenway Park. There's something about putting on those clothes and that beard, and it just all of a sudden, the first day we shot, Paul was like, I want you to find how Jim Bridger would act. How would Jim Bridger move? How would he say something? And I think by the 10th episode that we shot, I think we all kind of felt like, okay, there he is. And I can't wait to get back into it. But yeah, there's all those things put on. I will say this, I had my nose broken right before we went up in August to shoot, I think it was probably 7 episodes. I was doing jiu-jitsu and I got my nose, and I remember it made such a loud noise. The guy I was rolling with goes, "Oh my God, was that your nose?" I said, "Yeah." I ended up going to the hospital. I had a CAT scan, and it was broken, but I pulled up a picture of Jim Bridger, and old Gabe's nose is like pushed. He's got a very crooked nose. So I thought, okay.
Oh, yeah. I guarantee you he had his nose pushed around quite a few times.
Yeah.
And so what Rib was able to do, and he did this really just so well. I agree, he's an extremely handsome man. I was watching some episodes. I showed him some episodes to my wife and her sister. I was down in Georgia recently. I showed them the Prize Fighter episode, Rib. So it's you and Jaden Cowell, who plays young Wyatt Earp. And like halfway through the show, my wife looks over at me and she's like, "There are some really good-looking men in this episode." And I was like, "All right, no more show for you, baby. That's
Turn it
it.
off.
But what Rib was able to do is this is a collaboration between the two of us. Is like we have to kind of find the person that Jim Bridger is in a way that Rib can then bring that person to life on screen. And we tried to have we tried to have as much fidelity as possible to the historical record about Jim Bridger. But luckily, Jim Bridger, historically speaking, appears to have been an extremely likable guy. We know listeners to your podcast show, your Bridger series, will have heard that he was a fabulous storyteller, and he could go on and on with story after story and tall tale after tall tale, but always in an extraordinarily entertaining way, and that people would, gonna go out of their way to go sit by his fire and listen in. And he became semi-famous for that, to such a degree that he began to be a little bit resentful that everybody just assumed that anytime he told a story, he'd be stretching a yarn. He wouldn't be telling the truth, and he would get a little grumpy about the fact that, wait a minute, this is true. This is something that really happened, even though it sounds crazy. And so Rib has this likable quality. He has this quality about him that makes you want to sit and listen, to sit by a fire and hear his story. And then the other things about Jim Bridger that are well known is that he was really quite physically fit. He was lean, he was spare. He didn't have an ounce of extra body fat or body weight on him. He's relatively tall. He had a kind of a piercing look. Everybody remarked upon his really impressive appearance when they met him for the first time, and Rib has that. But the role goes so much beyond the physical appearance, and Rib, you did such a great job, really in that first episode or two, of deciding who you want Bridger to be, and then sort of perfecting it quickly, and then maintaining it is the most important thing, keeping it going, so that episode after episode, there would be plenty of times and you would say, wait, hold on a second. I don't think Bridger would do this. I don't think Bridger would say that. And I would almost always defer to you because you're the one living in the role, living the inner life of Jim Bridger in a way that I wouldn't be. And so doing that together, I thought we created just a very memorable, very realistic, and very believable character. So if you don't know anything about Jim Bridger, you're going to like Rib Hillis as Jim Bridger. But if you do know something about Jim Bridger, you're going to respect the performance that Rib brings because it's not out of known character for Jim Bridger.
Agreed.
I would add this, and on the very first day that I was there, I met Paul. He said, I want you guys to think about this, that these were real people living back then. And they were suffering, and they would get attacked by, wild animals and disease and danger, and just really imagine, because I think I was guilty of the mountain man, and it's kind of like Paul Bunyan, and it's sort of cartoonish, right? And that's how I imagine it. And Paul, on day one, and very, very simply, but just said, think about this. And Josh, you would know, because you talked about in the Bridger episodes about how they were dying left and right. Like you'd have days where you would lose 2-3 people, a month you'd lose 20-30 people. It was just like a war zone. And I think none of us haven't had to be in that position. So it was an interesting thing to sort of put myself in that world as an actor and realize that everywhere I went, there was danger. And that's what Paul, I think, was referring to. Like I literally did take the gun when I'd show up on set in the morning, and I wouldn't put it down. I carried that musket, and I had I had a pistol in my belt. I had at least a knife on me, and sometimes 2, and a hatchet, and I just carried them everywhere I went. And on a lot of movie sets and TV sets, you have a lot of creature comforts, especially for the actors. Paul would never sit down. There was no chairs on set. There was no director's chairs. We were a very active moving set, and I took sort of Paul's lead and just never sat down. Like I would literally sit on the ground on the dirt, and it sort of helped that idea of, Paul was saying that I was able to sort of bring what Jim would be, but it was easy when you're out there in the wilderness and you're just constantly thinking, I could get attacked right now. I could get attacked by a bear. I could get attacked by some natives that weren't happy. It was an incredible experience to sort of be immersed in that world.
Yeah, and it's really I think what's so fascinating about this period, and I'm so glad to try to share it with the world at large, is that we're portraying places that people know about today, that people have all been to. We've all been to Yellowstone and the national parks, and we've driven through the passes and gone through South Pass, whether we knew it or not even. And so we're portraying an America that is very, very well known and well represented and known to the world, but in a period of time in which it was all unknown. And so when Jim Bridger is on his way someplace, he may well be one of the very first white people to ever set foot, if not the very first white person ever set foot, known to have been anywhere. And when they went on these lengthy trapping expeditions, and this is Josh in your series about Jim Bridger, you would talk about this. They would go out for not days at a time or weeks at a time. I think a lot of Americans can picture, a tough camping trip. We're going to go camp for 2 weeks. We're going to be roughing it. They'd be away from civilization, any part of civilization, for a year or 2 years or 3 years. And in the case of Jim Bridger, I think he speculated at one point he didn't sleep under any roof at all for 4 or 5 years, except perhaps for a Native American teepee.
I think
Never.
I can't remember the exact time frame now, but I want to say he went something like 14 or 18 years without tasting bread.
Yeah.
Right. Because a lot of things that we take so for granted were simply unavailable to these men living on the frontier because it was so incredibly remote. It's hard to remember, or hard to understand now in the modern era, how big the United States actually is. And to Rib's point about going out to Montana and filming the series there, and we would get relatively remote. We never were more than maybe an hour outside of Missoula, but we would get into the backcountry a fair bit. You are immediately struck by simply how gigantic and big and expansive everything is. I mean, we were filming in places where you could see mountains on the horizon that could be 50 miles away. You'd be standing on a riverbank, and the river could stretch for hundreds and hundreds of miles and go someplace. Maybe it would join the Missouri eventually, or join the Yellowstone River. And so, again, part of what we're trying to convey to the audience is the incredibly deep isolation and, in some cases, the deep loneliness that these men would have felt being so far away from anything that could be associated with comfortable living in the East, even in the 1820s, where it probably wasn't that comfortable anyway. But even stripping away that very minor level of sort of domestic livability and dropping these men into the Rocky Mountains for 2 or 3 years at a time, it's really quite a remarkable achievement and an endurance test and a sort of a testament to how tough some of these men could really be.
Yeah, I mean, you think about, obviously they could be attacked at any moment, but think about the little everyday things. You couldn't go to a dentist. You got to assume these guys cut themselves on accident, cleaning animals, stretching fur, stuff like that. What do you do when you have an infected cut? They're just Jim Bridger had an arrowhead removed from his back that had been in there for a few years with no anesthesia
30 years,
other
I
than
think.
whiskey. Yeah. I mean, that's...
I had heard somewhere, and it may have been you that said it, that arrowhead ended up coming out, and Dr. Whitman took it out, and that arrowhead ended up being on display in Scotland or something. Am I crazy? I don't know if it was you that I heard it on your podcast, but that
No, I think it's true. Yeah.
I can't even fucking imagine having an arrowhead this big lodged in my back. If I have a splinter for a couple of minutes, I'm uncomfortable because every time you moved, that sharp edge would cut whatever sinew it's wrapped around. I mean, for 3 years, and he wasn't the only one. There was another guy. You could count how many they just would walk around with. Oh, got an arrow. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
I think it was Hugh Glass, actually. Hugh Glass had it.
Well, you got to think how injured he was. Are y'all going to cover that incident? Hugh Glass and Bridger's possible participation?
Yeah, I'll very briefly explain how we touched the story, and then maybe you can explain the story, sort of how you and Bridger share the story to the audience. So what we do in this episode, so to the question, are we going to portray the Hugh Glass incident that was also portrayed in the movie The Revenant, to start it off? Our series does touch upon that story that, the historical jury is out whether or not Jim Bridger was actually the guy with John Fitzgerald, who together abandoned Hugh Glass after he was mauled by a bear. So we made that part of Jim Bridger's backstory. We kind of made it part of his character makeup, and we're developing the series. And so it certainly indirectly affects everything that we do. And then, Rib, I'll hand it to you because you can tell sort of the story of the episode in which we actually, do talk about what happened with Hugh Glass.
Yeah, so that is a very famous episode in Mountain Man lore. The Hugh Glass, and they made obviously the movie The Revenant about it, and so we're assuming that Jim was the guy who was there, and then throughout this series, so we did 10 episodes. Jim is this. He's dispelling some wisdom, and there's a moral. Sometimes the moral is really obvious, like there's times where it's like you never leave a man behind, and he kind of refers back to, he's like, yeah, I learned a lesson a long time ago that you never leave someone behind, or something to that effect. Well, we finally, in the 10th episode, the final episode of the season, which I assume is going to still air as the last episode, Paul.
Yeah, we're keeping that. It's so good. We want to have a good, strong closure.
We have to, after watching 9 episodes of Jim Bridger, and the Tall Tales Jim Bridger, this final episode, he's gonna come face to face with Fitzgerald again, which is obviously we don't have any historical facts for that. But you know what? I would imagine that Jim Bridger and Fitzgerald may have bumped into each other somewhere along the way over the years, but we had this incredible episode where they see each other for the first time after 20 or 30 years, and it was amazing. The actor who played Fitzgerald was just incredible. As an act, this is what's so fun. I get to play make believe, but when I'm playing make believe of things that really happen, and so you want to try to, I don't know, take due service to what these men would have been like, and the final episode is pretty amazing, and it definitely taps on that. I don't know, Paul, do we have any plans to actually shoot a Revenant type episode where it's a super young Jim and the whole Hugh Glass bear attack thing, or has that been done to death already?
Well, I would like to. Well, I should say one thing about filming the bear attack is that the bear part of it is extremely difficult. And Revenant did a pretty great job portraying the bear attack, but they spent 3 weeks filming it, and they.
I know where to find a bear up in
literally
Montana.
millions
Outside of Bozeman, there's a bear.
There's a lot of bears up there, but we don't want to say, "Hey, Rib, go fight that bear. We'll stay back here and film it." So there's that. But because it has been, the event itself has been done, several times. Certainly in the Revenant, we portrayed it in the series Into the Wild Frontier, in which we had a sort of a different kind of a series, again, more of a documentary series. So I don't think we'll ever really portray that moment where you and Fitzgerald are together with Hugh Glass. But we may well go back to the story again, because as you know, spoiler, Fitzgerald survives his encounter with Bridger in that episode. And Fitzgerald could become an interesting nemesis to Bridger in future episodes. But Josh, this is something that the show has to navigate through frequently, because the show is about Bridger telling tall tales for which he's known. And so we took one story he was well known for. That's the story in which he claims that either the Crow or the Blackfeet or the Cheyenne or somebody chase him into a canyon and kill him. And that's always good for a laugh around the campfire. And so in one of the episodes, Bridger is confronted by somebody saying, "Oh, the story is so dumb and tired and silly. Why do you keep telling it?" And Bridger says, "But what if it's true?" And so in that moment, the show is throwing down the gauntlet saying, "Hey, we're going to tell you a story about how Jim Bridger dies and lives to tell the tale." And I won't spoil the episode, but the story adds up. It makes sense. And so in the Tall Tales of Jim Bridger, it's fictionalized adventures of real people for the most part. Jim Bridger obviously is a real person. And a lot of historical context that the show draws upon is based on Bridger's real experiences and real life. And, the stories take place both in a present tense, if you will, of 1867 or 1868 when Bridger is working, as you know, Josh, and you covered this in your final episode. He's working as a scout, mostly for the Army up and down the Bozeman Trail. And it's on the eve of the Red Cloud's War, which again, Josh, you covered, and you also alluded to covering that in more detail in other episodes of your podcast series.
Definitely.
So when we see Bridger in every episode, when you meet him for the first time, he is working as a scout. He's in the 60s, as Rib has said, and then something happens. There's an event. We call it the encounter. Something happens to him at the wagon train camp or on the trail, where he has to draw upon this, tall tale wisdom that he's got. And then the tall tales are largely fictional things that may well have happened. They could have happened. So there's never an episode in which no episode yet, nothing planned, in which Bridger is going to fight Bigfoot. And there's no episode where he's going to be in Ford's Theater in 1865 and he's going to wrestle John Wilkes Booth for the gun and not quite get there. He's not going to do that, and he's not going to survive Custer's last stand at the Bighorn. A little late in life for him anyway. He's probably blind at that point. So there's nothing that is just historically preposterous, but there are things that are historically fascinating that, historically speaking, could have happened. Without, again, spoiling any episode, we have an episode in which Bridger encounters the great frontier heroine Sacagawea, and he encounters Lewis and Clark's guide, Toussaint Charbonneau, who are both obviously real people. But we stretch the historical narrative somewhat by explaining that this is 1829, when modern historians, a lot of them presume that Sacagawea had died in 1812. There's a very persistent historical idea, and certainly there's an oral tradition amongst the Shoshone nation, and I read a great book about this after the fact, that Sacagawea actually lived to be quite old, and she died in like 1980 or 1881. And after the show, I went to the Shoshone Reservation to visit her grave, and on her grave marker says she died in 1881. So we have this great episode in which Bridger encounters Sacagawea, and the whole story is about that encounter. And so this is something that there's no historical record that Bridger actually met Sacagawea. Historically speaking, there's no reason, officially speaking, that it couldn't have happened, because Bridger was known to have encountered so many of the great names and people of the past of his era. And so we lean into that piece of what if history, and we make great episodes out of that all the time. And in the premiere episode, which is on January 11th, Thursday, January 11th, 8 p.m. on ISPN, put it in your calendar now. Bridger encounters a very young Wyatt Earp, who at the time, historically speaking, actually is working on railroad gangs in that part of the West, in Wyoming. So we don't know for a fact that they crossed paths. It's certainly entirely possible. Historically speaking, they could have crossed paths. And that's what the whole show is always going to be about, that kind of thing.
I like it, man. It makes you think, even if in 1867, is that when the episodes are taking place?
So yeah, and basically again, in Tall Tales of Jim Bridger, the episodes are really divided into a present day of Jim Bridger's life, which is
and then going back,
and then we go to an extended flashback that could be any time from the late 1820s onward, depending on what the story is actually about.
I was going to say, I get the age between a 60-year-old Jim and I go back to kind of in my 40s. But when they go back into like young Jim who meets Sacagawea, I think, and he's supposed to be in his 20s, they didn't think this weathered old face could pull that off. So we have another actor who is amazing, who played an even younger Jim Bridger that would be in that, 30s or something, Paul? 1820s, 1830s era?
That one's 1829. Yeah, Landon Tavernier.
Remy Barbiche gets to play both eras, though. Remy gets to be, he goes through all the ages.
Well, so Josh, we're talking about a character named Remy Barbiche. I don't know if he's in one of the episodes that you would have seen. He's a fictional composite of a Canadian voyageur, a French Canadian
young guy.
Voyageur. Yeah.
Okay,
so
I saw him in an episode, I think.
Yeah, you might have seen him in one of our episodes. And you mentioned before we started, you did one of your episodes about Kit Carson's conflict with Chouinard, this great French Canadian bully. So, because Wild Frontier, we did an episode about that. I've always been inspired and kind of fascinated by the voyageurs. as being these, the sharks and the jets of the frontier era. We've got the American trappers on one side, and you've got the French voyageurs coming down from the north, and they're just as tough, and they're just as determined, and they're angry at the Americans because they always think that they were the ones that came before the Americans, and the Americans are the newcomers, or the nouveau riche. And they always say, we were on these rivers and we were in these mountains long before any of you people ever left the East. And so Remy Barbiche is a fictional character who appears in, so far, 2 episodes. He's a French voyageur, and he's Bridger's nemesis, for reasons that we get into in the series. And so Bridger has 2 episodes in which he has to tangle with this thuggish, angry, violent man who's played with great charm. He's like a lovable, charming villain, and he's played by a wonderful actor named Jordan Jones, who he's like this really compelling and charming. He's not quite a Bond villain, but he's like the frontier French Canadian version of a Bond villain in a way. And again, so it's another example of how we take situations that Jim Bridger could actually have been a part of. He was in many situations where he encountered French Canadian voyageurs, and it was often a confrontational situation, because the French Canadians were trying to claim the same trapping and hunting grounds as the Americans.
His accent was not as good as yours, though, Josh. Your French Canadian accent is like, I think,
well,
it sets the bar.
yeah, it's hard to hold anybody to that standard. I wouldn't judge anybody for not being as good as me, But
I mean, as I sit here and we're talking about it, I just keep finding, like, thinking about, these men, and they live back there. And you, on one of your episodes I listened to the other day, you said that you were just fascinated by the mountain men era, that frontier era, and how it lasted, maybe 3, maybe 4 decades, which I think, it's pretty accurate. And think about these guys that, we have stories about that we're still telling. And, I love how these stories get larger than life, and obviously Jim's larger than life. But again, the thing that I think that we did a really good job of is grounding it in, this is real. I couldn't only imagine, like, being in Iraq, whatever, 10, 15 years ago, when you're going out every day with your platoon and you're getting in gunfights every single day. And the level of this, you're being, you could be killed at any moment is palpable and real. And that's what these mountain men were doing. And their stories get a little sensationalized and caricaturized, and it's fun to hear the stories. That in the Kit Carson episode, when he had that battle with the French Canadian, it's such a fun to visualize it. But imagine on the day, like, it probably wasn't fun. It was probably fucking terrifying.
No.
You got these people that are, like, his thumb gets shot off. Like, I don't know that anyone would laugh about your thumb getting shot off. Like, and yet obviously time makes it feel that way. But then in the same way, you have to somehow deal with it. I agree with you. How did you, Josh? I'm going to ask you a question. What is it that drew you to the mountain man era?
It's hard to pin it down. I've always been interested in history. I think when it comes to Western type history, a lot of it had to do with growing up in a household where there were always books around. And a lot of them were just really bad pulp fiction type books. Everything from Louis L'Amour, who's a great author, I think, to there was this guy named William W. Johnston. If you go to a Walmart or any used bookstore, you're going to go to the Western section, you're going to see 1,000,000 books by William W. Johnston. No offense, he's passed on now. No offense to any of his relatives who may be listening. They're not good books. But when I was 12, 13 years old, I thought they were really awesome. And he had this character who was a mountain man named Preacher. And I just really loved, that was my first experience with the whole, the fur trader era. And then my curiosity would want me I'd go to the library and look up books to find out about the real life guys like Jim Bridger and Kit Carson. And I've always liked history, particularly this era. But when I started the podcast, even now, I like to talk about the gunfighters, the cowboys, all that type of stuff. But to me, the most fascinating guys are these fur trappers. I mean, you were just talking about how everything changed. It was a short-lived period of time. A massive amount of change occurred during that time. And the reason I asked a minute ago about, when y'all do the present day footage in 1867, you think if somebody could have been a child, the Crow tribe, you could have been a 5-year-old child when Lewis and Clark showed up. And by the time when Jim Bridger's getting ready to be a scout during Red Cloud's war, you're a 70-year-old person. And you think about the massive amount of change that's happened between the core discovery and the Sioux Wars, of the Red Cloud's War, and then followed by the Sioux Wars. People live through that. And that's fascinating to me.
Yeah, we've tried to incorporate the idea of a changing frontier, how much it's changed from Bridger's early days to his later days. We made that kind of a core idea of the series in the series development. And even in the premiere episode, the episode you'll see first when the show starts, when Bridger encounters a young Wyatt Earp, he's giving him wisdom. He's trying to explain to Wyatt Earp why he shouldn't do a thing. And Bridger says words to the effect of, "No, you probably don't want to listen to some old timer." And Wyatt Earp is like, no, I've heard of you. Why, Jim Bridger, the old man in the mountains. Well, maybe you just don't understand how things are these days. And Bridger comes back and he explains to him, "I know better than you do. Well, right and wrong doesn't change with the times, son." I think is the line, Rib. And so we really want to show this contrast of Jim Bridger living by a code of conduct, and having an ethos and a moral system and value system from the early days of the frontier, from the 1820s, that's now somewhat at odds with what is his current modern world in the late 1860s, in which there are telegraphs crisscrossing the country, there are railroads that can cross the country and travel from Missouri to California in 4 or 5 days. When Bridger is a young man, the whole entire west of St. Louis, Missouri is simply a blank unknown, full of rumors. Thomas Jefferson believed there might be woolly mammoths living somewhere in the West. And by the time we reach Bridger in the present day of the series in 1867, much of that has been tamed and has been fenced and has been crossed by railroads and made into ranches and is being exploited for gold and coal and what have you. And here comes Bridger as a guide to people who know who he is, the most respected and respectable man on the entire frontier, and of whom only a fool would not take his advice. And yet we know, historically speaking, and you mentioned this frequently, Josh, in your podcast about in the last episode, how these army officers who are tasked with patrolling and keeping the Bozeman Trail safe would often ignore Bridger. And they would just think he's some old man who's past his prime, who gets scared of his own shadow and wants to sit by the fire and spin yarns, and they have a job to do. They have to fight the Indians. But the people that know who Jim Bridger is would be appalled by saying, "Why are you not listening when Jim Bridger tells you don't go into that valley? You don't go into that valley." When Jim Bridger says there's a big Indian encampment 10 miles away and they're intent on attacking the fort, you don't ignore that. You don't send out the woodcutting party anyway. What are you thinking? And so the show is always trying to be a juxtaposition of Bridger with one foot in this past, in this older period, which is already being mythologized in his own time, and yet trying to cope with the modern realities of life in the 1860s, in which a man like him is not necessarily able to find a home, but whose wisdom and whose understanding of the West is unparalleled, right, and his wisdom is still needed in the West.
These lessons just keep repeating themselves, and I think that's what I noticed in the 2 episodes that I've seen. I like how y'all are approaching that. A lot of these are timeless lessons. And he's certainly, if anybody knew what he was talking about, it would have been Jim Bridger.
Yeah, one of the things that I think you had mentioned it too, is you think about Jim and how did he have the success he had. Obviously physical. He could survive and he was lean and strong, but he had to be a really good talker, and not just a tall tales talker, but talking deflating situations. And you mentioned in your podcast and you read the books, like where he would ride out and see a party of natives, and he'd ride out and it could have easily been a battle, and he was just like, well, let's hear what they have to say. And then he ends up telling them stories. I got to think that he also was a fast runner, like all these different, because so many of his peers died, met their end along the way. And Jim, and I got to say, I love, he's a fallible person. He's human. And if he had left Hugh Glass, that's a a true sort of cross for him to bear. And I really love how history seems to have played out that Jim, he wasn't that bad of a guy. Like he had to defend himself when he needed to, but he wasn't. We don't hear stories about the Jim Bridger massacre. He obviously embraced the Native American culture. He had 3 Native wives. He has this incredible quality that you just kind of like, and honestly, me as a human being, but obviously me as an actor, you want to emulate. It's like, I wish I could be a little bit more like Jim. He's just, I think it's a worthy character was made to make a show about.
Inner toughness. I mean, by the time this man was in his 60s, he had to have been hurting. He had to have had massive arthritis. He was okay, and he's still sitting in the saddle all day, every day, riding across the prairie.
Well, one thing about Bridger that is actually well known that we didn't even want to get near in the show in a way,
right,
is that he had what I think is called a goiter, or a sort of a growth in his neck. Rib, you know about this, right? Have you heard about this?
Yeah, absolutely. From lack of iodine, from drinking snow melt, so he didn't have enough iodine in his diet, and he had a big throat. His nickname was actually Big Throat, or his native name. Yeah.
Right. And so, people that met him would admire the fact that he has this incredibly sort of athletic and muscular frame, but he had this sort of unsightly growth on one part of his neck because of the health conditions. Again, as Rib's saying, lack of iodine in the diet and lack of any plausible way to treat it. And so, he did have ailments throughout his life, but they got worse as he got older, and he did slow down somewhat. And again, Josh, you covered that pretty well in your final episode about how he eventually kind of moved back not to the East, but to the environs of St. Louis, where he had farmland. And he did a nice job, actually, Josh, explaining how he would spend his days in his waning years really not able to see. He'd have to use a cane or a stick to get around, but he would still walk around his lands all the time, and he could identify any animal by its sound, and he could probably identify things by their smells. And he had a pack of dogs with him. And Rib, we got to get you a dog in season 2. I don't know why we didn't think of that. I think Bridger should have a dog, because who wouldn't love that?
I've done plenty of talking dog movies, so I'm well versed at working with dogs. In fact, I know of a good Montana dog. Her name is Kelly. She lives in Bozeman, and she's she actually came from a reservation. She might be related to one of Jim Bridger's old dogs.
Is she a movie dog, a TV dog?
She's been in a couple of movies with me. It's my partner and best friend's dog, and yeah, she lives up in Bozeman, and she has been she's been in a couple of movies with us.
That would be great. I mean, there's plenty of opportunities for stories about the dog. Like, you just were telling me you lost your cat for a week. So what if Bridger lost his dog, and he would cross every mountain range in the world to get his dog back?
Maybe Bridger has a cat.
I mean, John Wayne had one in True Grit. I don't see
Bridger as a cat guy. I'm a cat guy.
Yeah,
but that's why
the original True. Well, the guy he was living with, the Asian gentleman, they had a cat.
Oh, I didn't know that.
Maybe it was both of their cats.
Interesting. I don't think INSP network is a cat kind of a network. I think they're pretty much into cowboy world, cowboy everything.
Dogs it is.
And West, yeah. But yeah, Jim, I don't think people know that much about Jim Bridger. The average American person who might listen to the podcast or you speak to on the street, if you mention, hey, what do you know about Jim Bridger? Have you ever heard of this frontiersman named Jim Bridger? They might have the vague idea that he's a mountain man, or more likely know nothing at all. And yet there are probably baker's dozen of major geographic features in the West named after Bridger. And
I've been to many of them.
Very ribs. Yeah, and there are specific accomplishments in American history and exploring the West by Americans that are directly attributable to Jim Bridger, is most likely being first American to encounter the Great Salt Lake, for example. And the one that is actually known to have discovered the water in the Great Salt Lake was salt water. He had, as you talked about, Josh, in your final episode, he blazed the Bridger Trail as an alternative to the Bozeman Trail. And if he had been able to convince this foolish army bureaucracy of the time that his trail was shorter and safer, which it was, Red Cloud's War might never have happened. And not just Bridger himself, but the effect that he had on so many people that encountered him really helped create the idea of the mountain man, which is such a powerful cultural signifier in American society, American culture. So many of the values that Americans live by and understand, and the way we value ourselves today, come from this mountain man era. It's an age of mythology that we value and we love, and that we, in many ways, we still try to emulate. And I think it's just such a fascinating period and such a fascinating time in American history that I think more Americans should know more about how America got to be the way it was based on the experiences of people like Jim Bridger in the frontier era in this
It's
time.
interesting. They led the way. I guess you could say the destruction of their own lifestyle. They trapped the beaver. When that went out of style, the immigrants were coming west. They started guiding for them. A lot of the roads that these guys like Jim Bridger discovered these were the passes that the immigrants headed to Oregon and Washington were using. It was just an end of an era for these guys, and they participated in it too. It is fascinating to me. There's really nothing like it. It seems like a very unique part of American history to me.
I think it's going on. It's still going on today. I've been going up to Montana for 10 years. I did a movie up there called Cowboys versus Dinosaurs that was 10 years ago, and I hadn't really been to Montana before. And I've been to Montana so much in the last 10 years that I kind of consider Montana home, even though I live in LA. Like, it's this strange sort of juxtaposition. And now when we go up to Montana, when we go and we're hanging out in Livingston, and we're shooting our movies up there, there's other movie crews literally walking down the street doing like their shot selection. I saw a director and a DP. We're shooting our show. We did a movie called Powder Pup, and we're shooting in Livingston, and there's another movie crew prepping for their movie. And kind of going back to what you're saying, like Jim Bridger helped to bring an end to his way of life. Well, our quiet little town of Livingston is no longer a quiet little town. They have a huge movie set there called Yellowstone Film Ranch, and they shoot episodes of, Yellowstone there. And, it's like, the little secret of the West is no longer a secret. And I'm sure Jim and his friends probably sitting around the fire were probably like,
They're sitting around. How much did you spend for that jacket at North Face?
Yeah. Yeah, as opposed to my buckskin that I shot.
Let's talk about the rendezvous, the Mountain Man rendezvous. I don't think with the network you probably can't get too R-rated, but those things were pretty wild. I don't know if y'all are going to be covering any of that in the Tall Tales of Jim Bridger. I know you have a little bit in Into the Wild Frontier, right?
Yeah. So in Into the Wild Frontier, the production budget is a little bit larger. It's an hour-long show as opposed to half hour. And so many of that show is far more factually accurate. It's a documentary, so we're very careful about factual accuracy. And so many stories that we tell in that series, they really, either originate in the rendezvous, or the characters have to be at the rendezvous for certain things to happen, certain real historical events. For Tall Tales, even though Bridger attended many of the rendezvous, maybe all of the 14 or 15 that were held. On the Tall Tales of Jim Bridger on the show, it's a pretty low budget show, and we don't feel like, at least in season 1, that we were able to really stage a rendezvous that would look good, frankly. The Mountain Man rendezvous, it started off as a small gathering. It was initiated by the Fur Brigade leader, Andrew Henry, and William Ashley in like 1823, as a way for them to bring supplies to the mountain men in the mountains, rather than the mountain men having to go back to St. Louis. And it turned to a yearly gathering where not only mountain men, but Native Americans from all over the West would gather in a certain place, like Pierre's Hole in Wyoming, or Jackson's Hole in Wyoming, or sometimes on the
It's like the
Popoakie
Comic-Con
River,
of
or
the
sometimes-
frontier.
I was thinking Burning Man.
It's like, exactly. And every year, it's like somewhere between Comic-Con and Burning Man and Coachella, I guess. So it was a method by which the men that were financing and organizing and basically owning the fur brigades, of which Bridger was one of those men at one point, they would bring supplies out to the rendezvous, wherever it was going to be held in a given year. They would trade the furs from the trappers that they brought in for goods. And then the trappers would go out for another year, and the traders would bring the furs back to St. Louis and resell them. And that's the basics of how the economy worked with this. But the trappers never really made that much money because it would depend upon how well their season went. If they had a good season, they would have a good, healthy haul of beaver pelts that they could get it to the rendezvous. They could actually trade it for quite a lot of goods. But they weren't getting paid in money or cash. They would be paid in supplies like gunpowder and lead for balls and knives and things like awls and sewing needles and hatchets and all kinds of things. Tobacco, of course, is a very, very important commodity, and coffee. But one of the biggest ones, of course, would be booze, would be liquor. And the mountain men, and these are all young guys, they're all 20s, they're all college age people. Instead of going to college and joining a fraternity and whooping it up and partying it that way, they had no way to really party and be social and blow off steam until the rendezvous would come around. And so the first thing would happen is the traders would arrive. They'd break open kegs of really, really bad whiskey, really bad rot gut, and everybody would get hell roaring drunk. And that's the accounts you mostly read of the rendezvous, of just extraordinary, hell-raising, loud, angry, drunken hullabaloo and brawling and craziness.
Isn't there that guy Meeks, the riverboat captain? Meeks, the riverboat captain, shooting a tin cup off his friend's head, and then he shoots him between the eyes. But then they were like, well, he never missed, so he must have done it on purpose. Like, that's just insane to me. Like, as drunk as you and I would get, Paul, I'm not going to start shooting soda cans off your head.
Oh, I appreciate that, by the way. But I trust you. If you want to try it, I trust you, Rib. I'll let you do that. It's Mike Fink.
Mike Fink, yep.
Mike Fink is this famous. He was a river keelboat captain, and he was known for being the toughest guy in the Missouri, and for drinking, and for this game he would play with a good friend of his, where they would get drunk and shoot a tin cup off each other's heads. But then they got into a argument of some sort over a woman or over a trade that went wrong. And Mike Fink said to his friend, and the name of the friend escapes me, it might have been somebody Collins. Hey, Collins, let's do it. Let's go play our shooting cups game.
Whoops.
And Collins knew there was some bad blood. And Collins was sort of saying to Mike Fink, yeah, we're cool though, right? We're going to do this. We're just going to have some fun, old buddy. It's not going to get weird, right? Mike Fink's like, oh, what are you talking about, man? No, we're friends. I'll shoot first. And so sure enough, he shot his friend right between the eyes over whatever this dispute was. And then just a week or two later, Mike Fink got his because the victim's friends decided to go out, get even with Mike Fink, and they killed him somehow. I don't remember the detail of the story. This idea of, eye for eye justice is something we talk about a lot in the series. We call it the law of the mountains. And we talk about it in the show. It's an idea in the show that it's in the premiere episode, actually. Out in the frontier, there is no law. There's no sheriff. There's no court. There are no judges. The law is what the men would make amongst themselves for each other. And it was a somewhat binding code of conduct. It was a moral system that they would live by. And that's part of the story of Kit Carson and his duel with Joseph Chouinard, the French-Canadian bully, over the attractions and charms of an Arapaho woman. At the end of that story, Kit Carson is well within his rights to kill Chouinard after Chouinard's shot misses. And I won't spoil the story for anybody, so that Josh, your great episode, people can listen to that, but it's a fascinating story. And so, yeah, there's stories like the one that Rib was speaking about, in which one man would kill another for some reason. And it ties into the stories we're talking about, the world of the rendezvous. These frontiersmen would get roaring drunk, and some old conflict that they had with another trapper 8 months ago about a prime beaver trapping spot or a stolen pelt. They would get drunk and decide to settle it. They would come to blows, or would come to knives, or sometimes it would come to guns. And whatever happened, the trappers themselves would decide if it was okay or not. If the violence was justified based on the facts that they knew, then they would say that was fair. And if it wasn't fair, based on the facts that they understood them, they would blame somebody, and that person could be punished in a number of ways. And so the frontier era is really fascinating. The rendezvous are really, really amazing. Long way around the barn to say that so far in season 1, we didn't portray any rendezvous, though I sure would love to do so because it would be a great storytelling.
Well, you know, what y'all do portray is that Bridger was a leader. He was a leader of these brigades. And these mountain men were tough, right? How tough did he have to be in charge of them? So, you know, that whole Machiavellian thing, is it better to be feared or respected? I'm pretty sure there were some guys that didn't want to tussle with Jim Bridger. But you can't just lead on that indefinitely, right? Because the guys were afraid of him. I think a lot of it came down to respect. He led by example. His men knew he wasn't going to ask nothing of them that he wasn't going to do himself. And they knew he'd already done it, you know?
It's on that note about Jim being a leader. That's something that I had to deal with and sort of figure out for myself as an actor, because, you know, you'd be on set and some of these actors, I mean, they're all incredible, but some of them, like the guy who played Bob Bullock, like he was bigger. He's taller than me. I'm 6 feet tall, 180 pounds. And he looked like he'd take a punch. Like, I mean, it looked like if we got in a fight, it would not be a fun fight. Like, and so there was not this, and so me as Rib, as the actor, trying to navigate this world of how physical can I be, and realizing you can't intimidate everyone, because there's plenty of people that are bigger than you, and there's plenty of people that you know, just don't scare and spook. And I would imagine, like you said, that Jim had to be very diplomatic and know when and how to deal with that. And as a leader, certainly as you get older, then, you know, there might be people defer to you because, okay, you're the wise old man. Or, you know, he's only 35, but he's been around for longer than everyone. And it's the same thing even now, like I said, like on set, you know, and I had to figure out how am I gonna. The guy who played, oh God, what's we got in a huge fight. What's the Native American actor?
Washaki, Michael Bricker, who played Washaki.
Yeah. And this guy's huge. He's like 6'2", 6'3", like 220, 230 pounds. He's actually a jiu-jitsu guy, and I think he did judo. And we get in this huge, brutal fight with knives and all this stuff. And me as an actor, I'm like, you gotta, I don't know. You had to navigate. Okay, how am I gonna make this look, you know, believable? Because you can't intimidate everyone. And I think, yeah, Jim, you would imagine somebody probably took a swing at Jim at one of these rendezvous, and he may have realized I should beat this guy up, or maybe, I don't know, maybe his reputation was such that he didn't have to, and people would be like, well, Jim's just smart and he's walking. But that is how you manage egos. And I imagine these mountain men out there, I think the reference to college, yeah, imagine a bunch of college guys, you know, going out and trying to work to get, like, it must have been just sort of this controlled chaos, really. God, it would have been fun.
Yeah, until I have nothing to add to that. Just until there's a million things that could happen.
Just until the Blackfeet show up and decide to like your horses.
Yeah.
And then it's not as much fun.
I mean, just, you know, in one episode, y'all had a guy with his arm had been broken. Looked like it was in a sling.
Oh, we actually broke that. We just broke it on set.
Oh, y'all just broke it? Okay. That's good. I was hoping y'all did.
Yeah.
But, you know, if you're a fur trapper, 1830, you have a broken arm. What happens? What do you do? There's no painkillers out there.
Well, I think, you know, what you did was you would simply power through the situation in the only way you could. You would just endure it and survive. They probably could set a bone, I bet, more or less. You know, different Native American tribes may have had a little bit more or less, understanding about how to treat some kinds of wounds. But you're right. There's no anesthesia. Even the anesthesia of choice of the 19th century, for the most part, like opium or alcohol, in the settlements you could get that, but out on the frontier, that wouldn't be there either. So whatever pain you were enduring, you simply had to endure the pain. And if your injury was debilitating, like if you broke an ankle or a leg or something like that, and you couldn't keep up with the brigade, or you couldn't stay with the people you're traveling with or hunt or anything, I don't know the details for sure, but I believe in some cases they would be forced to leave those men behind, but they would leave them with as much food as they could and powder and ball. or maybe they would try to get them to a friendly enough Native American group to say, we're going to leave this person with you. And Native Americans were, uh, you know, in the later part of the century, it was very hostile. In the fur trade era, it was hit or miss. Sometimes relationships were quite good, sometimes they were hostile. But mountain men could often turn to a relatively friendly local Native American tribe and leave the person. But as we were saying earlier, Jim Bridger got shot in the back with an arrow, and they broke off the shaft and they probed around trying to get the thing out. I think somebody said they used a wire to try to scrape it out. Couldn't get it out, so they bandaged him as best they could, and he kept on trucking. So minor injuries could amount to be something of a death sentence for you. If you lost your mobility, if you weren't able to move, and you were not close to anything at all, if you weren't close enough to a river to get picked up by a boat, if you weren't close enough to a friendly Native American village where they would care for you until you healed or not, be able to move around, you might have to deal with, being left on your own, I believe, on the frontier, with many resources as your friends could provide, but the brigade would have to move on. They couldn't linger very long in any one particular area waiting for somebody to heal, maybe a few days or a week or who knows what. But they couldn't sit around for, a month or 2 months waiting for somebody to heal, because they would simply trap out all the trapping and they would hunt out all the game and they would start to run out of food themselves. And so minor injuries could become extremely dangerous and deadly situations for almost anybody on the frontier.
Absolutely. Tell me more about anything particularly exciting or funny happened on set while y'all were filming.
Gosh,
Did anything funny happen? I can't remember that.
I'm thinking the same thing, and it sounds horrible, and I'm sure people listening be like, "What do you mean nothing funny happened on set?" We had a incredibly productive and hardworking set, but there was not a lot of sort of reverie and joking. Like there was, I imagine it probably was very similar to how life was for the frontiersmen, for the mountain men back then. Like we had tasks, and it was long, hard days, but it was all done. It was done happily, and we were glad to. But man, I guess we had some nights. Man, we were out like 4 a.m. 4 a.m. It wasn't freezing cold, but it was a little cool. And we'd been shooting for 12, 13, 14 hours. Paul's a maniac. He does not stop. He may not look like it, but he is like an Iron Man. And he would not stop. He has a trekking pole and no chair, and he just kept going. And it's 4 o'clock in the morning. And Paul's like, okay, great. We're going to just turn around. We're going to set up another shot, which means we're going to keep working. And there was just this, like this vibe. It was just this collective breath that everyone kind of went, because people are dog tired. And I was never going to quit. Like you literally, I would have been dead on the ground. I gave everything I had because Paul was just relentless. And, I think we ended up wrapping out pretty soon after that, but I mean, that's probably not a good example of like, any fun things happen on set, but we just worked. We just worked hard.
Well, sure. Yeah. I remember that night distinctly. I mean, there's just nothing, I'm speaking as a director, there's nothing like the feeling of, you have a scene you have to finish, and it's been a long, cold night, and it's been 14, 15 hours, and it's a weekend, it's a Friday night. Everybody's dying to leave, and you get this palpable feeling of everybody staring at your back, thinking, please don't do another shot. Please don't do another shot. And having to be like, I just need one more shot, or not, And I think probably one funny thing that we can wrap up on this. This actually was pretty funny, and it wound up saving an episode for a very strange reason. But Jim Bridger, the character, of course, is a storyteller. And many of our episodes start and stop. Rib, you'll know where this is going in a moment. A lot of our episodes start or finish with Jim Bridger. He's telling a tall tale, and that's how the story begins. And so at the end of an episode, we're shooting one day, shooting the last scene where Jim Bridger has done his heroic deed, and he has saved somebody from a terrible fate, and everybody's gathered back around the fire again. And the script is ending with Bridger saying, hey, let me tell you about the time that such and such a thing happened. And I just, Rib started doing the scripted scene. There's probably 4 or 5 lines. And I just decided not to call cut. And I just decided to see how far could Rib go spinning out this story, just adding stuff, ad-libbing stuff onto the story, just keep it going as long as he possibly could. And the answer was like shockingly long. He went going, kept adding to the story, where he wound up chasing a bear, and he was in a cave, and he came out of the cave, and he was supposed to loop something around the bear's ear, and it just went on and on and on, and he never broke character, and we didn't stop rolling, and it turned out to be an awesome, hilarious story. And finally, he just said, and then I got away. And it had been like 5 minutes of just straight up Rib ad-libbing this epic story, and the whole crew burst out laughing. We all laughing our ass off at how funny it was and how awesome it was. But now this is where it became a remarkable stroke of good fortune. That episode begins with Bridger finishing a story around the campfire when the crisis of the episode breaks out. And we had some problems shooting that day. I can't remember what it was. It was me mainly bungling my thinking about what to do. But for whatever reason, we didn't have coverage of the beginning scene around the campfire where Bridger is telling a scripted story where all of a sudden, out of nowhere, while he's telling the story, a girl is wandering off by herself. She gets bitten by a rattlesnake. And we didn't have good coverage of Bridger telling the beginning story. But then we remembered in post-production, wait a minute, we did one take where Rib just spun off this endless tall tale. Let's just use part of that. And so we put it in the beginning of the scene of the episode. It's the same campfire. It's the same situation. Bridger's wearing the same costume, and it works perfectly. So this ridiculous, endless story that Bridger told just for a laugh in production actually saved our bacon in post-production, because we needed a story from Bridger that we could use for the beginning of it because we didn't have it for some reason.
There you go. It was meant to be.
I remember that. well. Yeah, they didn't say cut, and you're in a scene, and the scene. I've had my best friend. He says you never quit on a take. You never quit because you never know what's going to happen. You might slip, fall down. Stay in character. I don't care. Maybe you're supposed to ride a horse, you fall off your horse. That might be the take that you use. And so nobody said cut. And so I had to tell this. I just started telling this story. And it's like, did I ever tell you the time that my best friend dared me to tie a bow around the ear of a grizzly bear? And then I just kept going because he didn't say cut. And I'm like making this story up on the spot. Well, yeah, it was the middle of winter. I had to crawl through like a mile of snow to get in there. And it just kept going. And when I finally ended up getting the part, and then I ended up down in Virginia City, and there was a horse. And then I did what's called breaking the fourth wall, and I just looked right down the barrel of the lens after telling this story. And everybody cracked up. And sure enough, that ends up in the show. It's pretty fun.
Not the whole story, not the whole 5-minute story, but thank God we have it, because that saved that episode.
That's good, man. You got a professional crew, it seems like. Not that I know what I'm talking about, but I mean, just you mentioned earlier. You mentioned earlier about it not being a huge budget, but I'll tell you, I couldn't tell. This is a little unrelated. I was recently doing a little bit of research, and I found this documentary on a guy I'm covering. That was the most recent documentary on this guy was from the mid-90s, 1990s. I've never seen such poor production work in my life. I don't know what they were thinking, and it was a major. I won't say the name of the network. It was a major network. And I know y'all are probably operating on a fraction of the budget that these guys were back then. Everything, as far as I'm concerned, is very, very professional. Even, you're shooting on location. Earlier, we were talking about The Revenant. They weren't shooting on location. You guys are where Bridger actually walked, where he lived a good amount of time.
Yeah.
Yeah. Go ahead, Paul.
I was just going to say quickly that the inside baseball about some of this stuff is, a show like Into the Wild Frontier, or a show like the one you're talking about, Josh, just about an Old West outlaw of some sort. These are known as, quote, recreations shows. And the idea of a recreation show has a bit of a bad odor to it because, for so long when people were doing, quote, recreations in a otherwise documentary show, like a true crime show or historical show, they always had really low budgets, and they always looked cheesy as heck. And part of it is, part of it's lack of money, but also part of it is just not having really talented, people with film or narrative TV background trying to put these recreation sequences together. You'd have people do documentaries or do reality shows and stuff, and they just always look bad and be cheap and silly looking, and it's kind of given the idea of a quote recreation show unquote a bad name. But we've seen time and time again, and I like to think the shows that I've done, the shows like Into the Wild Frontier, technically it's a recreation show, it's a docudrama. We call them now factual dramas. It all means the same thing. We really invest a lot of effort into making the dramatizations be as dramatic and compelling as possible. And the documentary parts are really just a little bit of icing on the cake. And again, to be clear, Tall Tales of Jim Bridger is not even that. Tall Tales of Jim Bridger is a purely scripted show. It's a historical drama in the same vein as a new Bass Reeves show or as 1883. Tiny fraction of the budget, but otherwise it's an Old West show of the kind you would see on of any other network.
If y'all ever need somebody to stand in the background up there, you ever need like Jim Bridger's
Josh, I was thinking the same thing.
Slow-minded little brother or something like that. I just stand there and I can pull off a simple-minded guy.
Well, I will say we get a season 2 coming out of this. I think we need to have Josh up there. But I want to give a quick shout out to the people working behind the camera, because you were referencing watching something and looking at sort of production value. When you can throw all the money in the world at something, it still doesn't mean it's going to be great. But when you have people that are literally will give every ounce of their energy and time and effort and expertise to something, like, it was absolute incredible to watch this crew from our camera department, our sound department, the wardrobe department. He came out from Virginia, right? And he had all this incredible gear, wardrobe that, oh my God, those shoes. I'll tell you, we were running around in these shoes that are apparently authentic era shoes, but they had slick leather bottoms. Man, it was a pain in the ass. But it added to it. It gave every little bit. And everyone was there at 4 o'clock in the morning when we were shooting, the makeup department. And there's, on movie sets and TV sets, and like anything, and I imagine even like Jim Bridger, there's an energy, there's a, like when you're on a ship and there's like, oh, I don't know, we might have a mutiny on this ship. We never had that. There were hard days for sure, and there were days where people were like, fuck, man, I need a beer. But there was this sense of we're doing something together. And this was, and I remember one day talking and saying that this was something that we could all be proud of. And I think it's turned out so that you do something that it isn't the money. It's you doing it for a greater cause. I personally, this is my dream job. And the fact that I'm getting paid to do it, and probably shouldn't say this out loud, but INSP wouldn't have to pay me for this. It's just a dream. But everybody seemed like they were there for the right reasons. And, eventually people might decide it's not for them and they might move on. But we had a real, everybody was bringing everything they had. So I'm glad that you noticed that we were able to deliver something that has a production value that far surpasses the budget. It was really incredible.
And I'll say one more thing. Part of what you're saying, Rib, about how the crew was, dedicated and gave it their all, and didn't gripe and didn't complain, and was generally cheerful and generally, just got the job done and, enjoyed the good parts and just powered through the rougher parts. In a very big way, Rib, I've said this to you before. The tone on the set. That good tone that we were talking about is very much due to you personally, the way you behave on set, because you were beloved by the entire crew. And we can't really take that for granted from actors, as we know. Sometimes actors are difficult, or at least just not necessarily difficult, but not warm and open and thrilled. And you exuded so much enthusiasm every day. You'd show up at base camp every morning just saying, let's get started. I can't wait to start. And you put so much heart into it, and you were so kind and friendly and pleasant and uncomplaining in all these difficult times. I mean, I think you contributed so much into this spirit of getting it done and doing it well I've said this to you before, and I can't thank you enough for being Rib Hillis as well as being Jim Bridger, because if we had had a difficult or unpleasant or disagreeable person and you are not any of those things in any way, it could have been one of those shows that we both been on where it's a hate show and everybody kind of hates each other and you're all just dying for it to be done. And it wasn't that at all. And I really give you basically all the credit for that by just being the lovable heart of the show. So I really appreciate that. And I know the crew feel the same way.
Man,
Thank you.
Rib, you got me talking about how handsome you are. Now you're a nice guy.
Yeah.
Earlier you had to drop that you know jujitsu. Dude, save some pussy for the rest of us, man.
Well,
Slow down a little bit.
it's all
buddy.
yours. Well, I've been doing this for a while, and it's a dream come true. You know, and I think it's a nice synergy for the role that I get to play both on and off screen and the character I play. And then I can imagine Jim Bridger waking up in the morning and they're out in the middle of, hostile territory and having to say to his men, like, hey, we got to keep our heads on straight and let's make sure we, work hard today and nobody drops their guard. Like it was this strange sense of like, yep, this is if Jim Bridger were alive today and he were an actor, he'd be here doing this. So,
Well, gentlemen, I really appreciate you taking the time to talk to me.
Oh, I'm very happy to do so. Thank you. And I always love hanging out with Rib. So, any excuse to do that is good. So yeah, thank you for giving
That's
us the opportunity.
January 11th.
January 11th at 8 p.m. Eastern time on INSP. And I know this because I just did a bunch of promos, and you can tune in every Thursday night at 8 p.m. Eastern time. So I was going to say that I'm just thrilled that I was able to get on here and talk to you so I could see you, because I've heard your voice. And I was like, this whole thing is a ploy so I could just see what you look
Y'all
like.
just wanted to see if I was a black guy or a white guy, I think.
So I still don't know. I still can't see either of you guys.
The mystery deepens then. Well, I appreciate it. I
Thank
thank
you
you
so
for all
much,
the
Josh,
kind words. I appreciate both y'all actually listening to my podcast. That means the world to me.
Yeah, and you just remember us when you have the biggest podcast on air. You do what you do is really good. You can tell that you have that same, you have that passion. You're passionate about what you're doing. The enthusiasm comes across.
Yeah.
And I think that really conveys. So.
Oh yeah, and likewise, I know when you first messaged me, just you talking about reading up on Jim Bridger and trying to learn as much as you could about him. I like that a lot because you can tell on screen when somebody's just there to say the words versus somebody that's really immersed themselves in it. It sounds like you're almost at that level. What was it, Tropic Thunder, where Robert Downey Jr. didn't break character until the DVD commentary? You're almost there with Jim Bridger, so that's pretty cool. I think that'll definitely show on screen. Okay, great. Well, I appreciate it again, y'all. This was really fun. All right, thanks again to Rib Hillis and Paul Epstein. It really was nice talking to these guys. I'm hoping if they ever need Jim Bridger's idiot brother, they'll cast me for the role. Don't forget to check out The Tall Tales of Jim Bridger, airing this Thursday, January 11th on INSP. That's The Tall Tales of Jim Bridger, January 11th, INSP. If you're itching for some true tales from the Wild and Woolly West, head on over to wildwestextra.com. While you're there, hit that contact button. Let me know what you think of The Tall Tales of Jim Bridger. And if you're looking to learn more about Jim Bridger in general, maybe a little companion piece to supplement The Tall Tales of Jim Bridger, check out the series I did on the man not too long ago. Link down below in this episode's description. And please don't forget to tune back in this Wednesday for part 2 in the series on John Wesley Hardin. We'll examine Wes's relationship with Wild Bill Hickok and talk about the snoring incident. You know the one. All right, till next time, adios.